Hello there, this is Neil, and I'm so excited to be here to talk to you PhD students about getting finished in your PhD in half the time. Yes, you can if you focus on many of these ideas that I share with you. So let's get into the good stuff, shall we? Today I'm going to talk about the literature review, the key to creative writing. And it really is. People think literature review is so structured, and creative writing, how can they go together? Yes, they can go together. You can be much more creative when you really understand what the literature is about. I'm going to take you through 6 areas or 6 steps in undertaking literature review, but actually starting off with a basic literature review and then actually honing it and honing it and honing it further through different approaches or different strategies that we can take. But we're going to start with the basic research question of a real research project that I'm currently undertaking and show you how our first initial literature review was so broad that it was just humongous, and we were unable to think about what are we contributing to and convince reviewers that we are making an actual practical contribution. So we're going to start with that. Then we're going to refine the scope of the literature and bring it down from several disciplines into a single discipline. And that's where we go from international business to a global supply chain, which is much more specific than an international business literature. And then we're going to go even further, dig even further and go to the third part, where we map the studies in your area. And here's where we actually divide up the tables in literature review, and we put ticks and crosses to show whether different studies are a member of a particular category that you think is important in distinguishing your project from the literature that has tried to tackle a similar research question in the past. Then we're going to go to the 4th area where we talk about dealing with terminology or nomenclature, because different disciplines have different terms for the same construct, or they use the same term but it means different things or different constructs. And so it's very, very important when you're writing, what terminology or what nomenclature are you using, and that is very, very critical. So we even dig deeper in actually understanding nomenclature on a particular dependent variable in our study. Then we're going to go to the 5th step where we talk about memory, keeping your memory, going back to the basics. And memory works on look and feeling. The feelings, the looks, your brain remembers things that you have done. So working with a book brings greater memory to your mind than just reading a tablet, for example. We're going to talk about how I use cut and paste to actually go through and actually analyze the literature with cutting and pasting articles. Sounds like kindergarten English? Yes, it is, but it helps the memory, and anything that helps the memory can help you in your creative writing. And then we're going to focus on this area on one part, the measurement construct, and how I've actually cut and paste to help my memory to understand, well, what exactly am I talking about when I'm talking about measurement, when I'm talking about the measurement of performance measurement, for example, in organizations. Then finally, we're going to look at the contribution, how to use your summary to guide your contribution, and new relationships examined. So join me on this fascinating journey of the literature review, where we dig right in to help you finish your PhD in half the time. So let's get into it, shall we? First step, the basic research question. I want to introduce you to the study that I'm going to take you through. We begin with a basic research question. We're going to introduce an independent variable and a dependent variable. At least we've got to have some study to work around. What is it in this case? In this case, we are looking at the dependent variable, whether and how original equipment manufacturers use selection routines, IT integration, or supplier monitoring to control their suppliers in distant countries. And we're actually looking at the independent variable, that is culture distance and geographical distance, as very important constructs that may drive the amount of control that a particular OEM manufacturer may want to have over its suppliers in the supply chain. And also we're looking at moderating factors such as economic independence, customer concentration, asset specificity, complexity. So these are very important constructs, but for now in understanding literature review, we want to focus on the culture distance, geographical distance, and the control relationship. And we want to know in the literature, has other studies in the broader literature, business literature, looked at this area? So we have our first basic cut of the literature, and what does this cut mean? Okay. Here we have Appendix A, and this is a list of studies supporting the positive relation between culture distance and formal control. We could group our different controls under informal or formal control, and we've got to start off by defining the dependent variable at the moment, and we're just going to call that formal control, but we're going to ask the question formal and informal. We'll keep it broad, so we want to tick off 5 different categories. So here we have all the literature here, and we're going to tick whether they have actually looked at the choice of control made by MMCs, the formal control used in MMCs, the use of informal controls in MMCs, and what about the formal control in interfirm partnerships and the use of informal control in interfirm partnerships. So we are sort of dividing up the literature in terms of, has the literature looked at particular types of entity forms? And now this is very broad. This is international business literature. It has been around for several decades. As you can see, some of these early studies are in the 90s. And look at these studies here, 1990 for Chu and Anderson. They are Cugat and Singh, 1988. So we're going back 30 years, aren't we? All right, and again, you can see most of them have looked at the multinationals' choice of entry mode. Very few of them have looked at the use of formal and informal, or the use of formal and informal controls in interfirm partnerships, even if we're not talking about MMCs and their foreign subsidiaries. So that's our first cut of the international business literature. And in some ways, what we found is that is kind of out of context in what we are looking at, because the context of my study is the global supply chain. So let's have a look at the next stage, or the next step that we want to go to. That is, we want to refine the scope of the literature from international business to the global supply chain. And so here is a good study that has done something similar to what I'm about to show you, and it is Handley and Benton, Journal of Operations Management, 2013. And so they looked at the influence of task and location specific complexity on the control and coordination costs in global outsourcing relationships. Now notice that we have the independent variable in the title. We also have the dependent variable in the title, that is control and coordination costs. And then we have the context in global outsourcing relationships. So that's a nice title. We have the independent variable, we have the dependent variable, and we have the context. Wow, beautiful title. And so basically what Handley and Benton are proposing is that control costs and coordination costs are going to be a function of several measures of task-specific complexity and several measures of location-specific complexity. And fast forward to my study, we are looking at geographical distance and culture distance. So we could actually take some pointers from this study going forward. So as you can see, Handley and Benton have already looked at geographical distance, culture distance, and control costs and coordination costs. Now we are looking at similar things. We're actually looking at control mechanisms and not the costs per se, but we are looking at a range of independent variables which are similar to what Handley and Benton have looked at. Now what is very special about this study is they also just focused on the supply chain, the global supply chain, but they actually focused their literature review on the service supply chain mainly because their context was the control costs and coordination costs of service outsourcing. So for example, when a bank in the US may outsource its back office services to Asia, for example, or another firm may outsource their secretarial services to another country or to the same country. So we're looking at the distance as service provider is from the service recipient who is outsourcing that service. And if they're further away, or if they're further away geographically or culturally, then they'll have implications for control costs and coordination costs. Okay, so now let's bring these ideas into our literature review, where now I want to take you to the literature review that we did after our initial international business literature review, which was very generic, because that international business literature review focused on multinationals' control of the subsidiaries or inter-firm relationships, but not necessarily the supply chain, more like joint ventures and things like that. So here's the refined model for our study, and now we have formal controls, informal controls as our governance mechanisms, or as our control dependent variable. And we have now location specific complexity, task specific complexity, just like Hanley and Benton. So now the Hanley and Benton study is now guiding our study. We have gone from a distance construct as a independent variable, and now we're focused on location specific complexity and task specific complexity, and culture distance, geographical distance are proxies for location specific complexity. Of course, there are proxies for task specific complexity as well, which is following on from Hanley and Benton. So much more refined, much more specific. Now, I want you to take a close look at the dependent variables, because what we're going to do now is go to a literature review in the supply chain literature to find out, have studies looked at geographical distance or culture distance in relation to some kind of control variable. So let's have a look, shall we? So we're going to start with the studies that support a positive relation between culture distance and the use of formal controls in inter-firm partnerships. Now we say inter-firm partnerships. Now we're focusing much more on the supply chain partnerships. Okay, so let's be very, very clear here. Supply chain, not international business. We're not talking about the remote management of subsidiaries here. And so we have several studies here, and they all support a positive relationship. That is, the greater the culture distance, then we're going to have more formal control. But have those hypotheses all focused on formal control? I don't know. What we have done is just summarize the culture distance related hypothesis. Some of these are related to formal controls, some of them are not. For example, the first one, CD has a negative influence on relationships between relational learning dimensions and information sharing. So that's not formal control. Here, the second one, Goris and Peters, the greater CD between domestic and offshore operations, the more likely a firm will choose a captive offshore governance mode. Is that formal control? Well, broadly, but again, I haven't defined it. And then we look at Hanley and Benton, control and coordination costs increase when culture distance between the customer and service provider increases. Again, control and coordination costs is another angle of looking at some kind of control. But is it formal control? Not exactly. As you can see, what we've done in this first brush literature review, we have gone from the international business literature to the supply chain literature, and we've done a first pass summary of the hypothesis to get a sense of what is the general scope of the dependent variable. Okay, so let's have a look at those that have looked at a negative relationship between culture distance and the use of formal control. And as we can see, some of these papers here have picked up ideas like psychic distance and the use of output controls over foreign distributors. Or what about Evans, Mavondo, and Britson entering physically distant markets like, when entering psychically distant markets, psychic distance, and culture distance is kind of a subcomponent of psychic distance. Retailers should adopt a low-cost, low-control entry strategies to adapt their retail strategy to a greater extent. Again, is that formal control? Kind of, but it's more of an entry strategy. As you can see, we are mixing up several studies here. In this first pass literature review, we've added in just about every study that has started to look at supply chain management across borders. And some of these studies have looked at culture distance. Some of them have looked at another type of distance. Some of them looked at control, but some of them looked at other types of control. They don't always fit. So very broad. We've gone from very, very broad international business. Now we've got broad in the supply chain management literature. What we want to do now is dig deeper. We want to dig deeper into key variable measures, focusing on constructs. So let's get into that. Here, now our third pass at the literature review, now we have started to delete some of those studies that did not look directly at particular control measures that are used. So we cut out some of the entry mode studies. We have cut out some of the psychic distance studies. I think some of them may still be in here, but let's see what we've got. Let's give you an example. Gouris and Peters. Now we have created a column. Which type of construct have they used in the independent variable? Culture distance or geographical distance? Zhang, Coverskull and Roth use culture distance, whereas Hanley and Benton use culture distance and geographical distance. What about the control construct? Now we have a particular column for the control construct. And if Gouris and Peters, captive versus outsourcing, offshore governance, or Hanley and Benton, control and coordination costs. Wow. And so now we have the hypothesis, then we have the sample, and then whether the hypothesis is supported. So here is our third pass, and now we're starting to get some informative comparison between the different studies, because now we can say 1, 2, 3, 4 all looked at culture distance, and then number 5 looked at culture distance but not geographical distance. Now we go to the next stage. Those that looked at a negative relationship between distance, we can see that Ballo and Gilliland looked at psychic distance. Bonte 2008 looked at geographical distance, and as you can see, different studies have used different measures of distance. And so very, very clear to see now with this third pass literature review is we've suddenly, you can see without reading differences between the studies, because we have made a specific category in this column for a particular type of proxy for distance. And again, on the control choices, we know Ballo and Gilliland looked at output control. And then we looked at Bonte, looked at interfirm trust. Next one, Evans et al. Looked at entry strategies. Now you can see that not all studies looked at output control. Harmer-Cleargill looked at output control, behavior control, and plan control. And as you can see, all of these studies have looked at different dependent variables. And you can see that clearly without having to read, because it's just a matter of going down a list. So we are converting sentences that describe a study into particular lists that enable you as a reviewer, you as a reader, to see very, very clearly which studies are similar, which studies are dissimilar. So now, can we go deeper? Yes, we can. We want to actually go deeper into these variable measures. So here, what we have done is actually put the name of the dependent variable in this column, the name of the independent variable in this column. But now we want to parse out the dependent variable and find and really put a tick next to all of those studies that have actually looked at output controls, all of those studies that have looked at informal controls. So let's have a look, shall we? And that's what we're doing here. We're digging deeper into variable measures. We are focusing on constructs. We want to create categories that speak for themselves. In other words, you put a yes or no if a study has actually measured a particular variable. And so here we have our fourth pass literature review. And so now I've created a particular variable called formal controls. I've created a particular variable called relational controls. I've created another one called other, and then we've got hypothesis, hypothesis supported. And now what you can see now is that we have the current study, that is what we're focusing on, culture distance, formal controls, relational controls, and we want to know, are other studies matching the current study? And as you can see that Nussembeni does not match our study, Kaufman and Carter does not match our study, although they have measured an informal type governance construct like obstacles to international sourcing, social bonding, or Chung, Myers and Mensa looked at relationship learning. They did not look at formal controls or relational controls. Then Omar et al. Looked at collaboration, coordination. Parenti et al. Looked at supplier integration. So now we're starting to see patterns across studies because we have now created 1, 2, 3, 4 different columns for representing different constructs. And then we just show you very clearly in the patterning what studies are matching where we want to focus. And we can then explain to the reader, the reviewer, well, our study is focusing on this area and there's only 3 other studies that have looked at this area. So let's have a look at the studies, more studies following this. We can see when we go to the next page, again, very few studies have looked at formal controls, except for we go to Chowdhury and Sabharwal that looked at proposed a negative relationship in distant control. They looked at behavior control and clan control. So there's only one other study that looked at behavior control and its relation to geographical distance. And yeah, one other study. And if we go to another page, we can start to see that Griffith-Lee et al. Looked at adaptation of detailed contracting, which may be close to formal control, and adaptation of relational behavior as a relational control. So maybe they're close to our study, but they looked at psychic distance. They didn't look at culture distance or geographical distance. Wow. And they didn't even find a positive relationship for the H1 of relational behavior. They found support for their H2 looking at detailed contracting. Okay, and we go right down to the bottom and look at Sachev and Bellow where they looked at monitoring. So again, there's another study that ours is actually maybe close to, but again, they looked at cultural distance, geographical distance as a moderator, not as a direct driver of control. So we need to be careful here as well. So as you can see, what we've done over those 4 steps, or those 4 different literature reviews, we start off international business literature. Then we go down to the supply chain literature. Then we actually refine the supply chain literature even further to actually try and show the different categories of dependent variable and the measurement of distance. Then we get one step further and we actually parsed out different types of governance mechanisms into formal, into informal or relational governance mechanisms or other. And suddenly you start to see patterns, or suddenly you start to see that very few other studies are looking at the variables that we are looking at in our paper. And that may be prima facie evidence for supporting that there is a gap in the literature. So now we can write our basic literature review. And so as Table 1 demonstrates, the empirical literature, which explicitly considers the impact of location-specific complexity factors on interfirm governance, is limited. First, we identify 5 studies. So now we can count the 5 studies which have examined culture and geographical distance and its relationship, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we can actually count up the studies that have actually looked at relationship between geographical distance and particular mechanisms. And then we are referring to all of the relevant studies. Second, most studies have examined the informal dimension of governance mechanisms. As you can see from my summary earlier, very few studies have actually looked at the formal dimension of governance mechanisms. And so now the second paragraph of our literature review is to just textualize and actually narrate what is quite obvious in the literature review table. Wow. Third, the institutional setting of the supplier or service provider has not been systematically accounted for. As I may have briefed over briefly, we can go back. You can see that what I've done here is put in the institutional context of the service provider, emerging market, emerging and developed, unknown, 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 emerging and developed. As you can see, they did not all look at the same institutional context. And if you theoretically believe that institutional context matters to the theory that you are testing, then this is another point or another column of distinction where you can differentiate the past literature from what you are focusing on in your current study. So let's have a look. That's what we're saying here. The institutional setting of the supplier or service provider has not been systematically accounted for. For example, Western companies source considerable portions of their purchasing spend from suppliers in emerging markets, which presents a heightened supply risk regardless of culture or geographical distances with the buyer's country. However, Zhao and Zhu suggest that because of weak institutions in emerging economies, detailed contracts are ineffective in containing partner opportunism in contractually specified areas. So I'm explaining why, with reference to the literature, why the institutional context matters between emerging economies and developed economies. And so that's what the third paragraph is about. And so now we go to the fourth paragraph of our literature review. Most studies that have found support for the location complexity hypothesis have focused on the service sector. What I have not probably briefed you very detailed on in the table earlier is that most of them looked at the service sector. They have not looked at the supply chain. They haven't looked at the physical supply chain context. And this is just a fourth area that we just wanted to make clear and differentiate our study from, that we're looking at the control of physical product suppliers in another country. And theoretically, we would want to argue that that matters, and that's different from controlling a service provider in another country. For the one thing, with service providers, you as a recipient have a role to play in designing and the coordination of the service to be provided. Whereas when you are sourcing from a physical product provider, you are not associated generally with the inputs to that supplier. With a service provider, you are associated as a buyer with the inputs. So a little difference there we could make, and it's possible that this fourth paragraph could be also relevant in the literature review. And then we can say, summarizing, while trust appears to be consistently found or argued to be a driver of governance arrangements, little consistent evidence exists for the positive or negative influence of culture or geographical distance for and the use of governance mechanism in the outsourcing context. As you may have seen, what I have actually separated the studies that have looked at positive influence and those that have looked at negative influence. So sort of they're all over the place in terms of predicting a relation with geographical distance or culture distance or psychic distance for that matter. Okay, so there's our basic literature review, but I think we can go even further, really. And that's where we want to go a little bit deeper to understand what is the terminology we are playing with. So governance may work very well in the international business literature, governance may not work so well in the supply chain literature. I don't know. We need to go into the supply chain literature in a little bit more detail to find out. And that's what we're going to do here. Variables aren't constructs until you understand the construct, e.g. governance. What does that mean? Socialization. What does that mean? Monitoring. What does that mean? Formal. What does formal mean? Okay, so let's find out, shall we? And so what I've done now is starting to think about formal controls and informal controls. And now what we have learned from the earlier literature review and the tabulation of the previous literature is that a lot of focus has been on the informal controls, very little focus on formal controls. So that's a clear motivation for why we want to understand the use of formal controls. Now, we're not talking directly about contracts. We're actually talking about the actual formal strategic mechanisms that are put in place. So like formal planning, and then the formal visits, okay, formal collection of information that happens after the contract is signed, and then during the actual process of the supply and the resupply over the time of the relationship. Okay, so formal controls has a role, but to what extent does it have a role? Not all studies have actually looked at formal controls and found that they don't matter. They haven't looked at formal controls from the get-go. So how do you know they do not matter? So here's our refined model now, and now we want to go into the literature to really understand, is formal control and informal controls, is this the best terminology to use to explain what our dependent variable means? Now maybe now we want to dig deeper and just focus on formal controls, but let's have a look at the literature anyway. So now this is where I'm actually getting my book, and I start and cut and paste. And there's a method to my madness here. And the reason is that it helps me to remember different studies. And it's much quicker to take 10 studies in a book like this and make clear differences between them through highlighting different colors and different pen markings is what I do. So let's have a look at some of my cutting and pasting and what I've done. So first of all, I started off with the basic IB literature that really focused on the China context, because this is where the whole idea of informal controls came about as being important in an emerging economy where relational context seems to matter. And so we have Li, Popo, and Zhao, 2010, they looked at formal contracts. But what was really interesting is that in a similar measure, we have Zhao, Popo, and Yang use customized contracts. Really? They use a different word to describe the same measure? Yes, they did. Can they get away with that? Of course they can, because the first paper published in a strategy journal, the second paper published in International Business Journal. Different journals can accept different terms for the same measures. That's what I was explaining to you earlier. Okay, all right. What about jibs? Well, here's a similar measure, but now Zhao and Popo, jibs, call the same thing explicit contracts. Previously, they called them customized contracts. Now they're explicit. Wow. Well, you can do this when you are a important author. What about Zhao and Zhu? They looked at detailed contracts for a same measure published in jibs. So now we have formal contracts, explicit contracts, detailed contracts. We've got same authors calling the same measured variable different terms. No wonder why PhD students get confused. I understand it's not easy doing a PhD. This is part of the trouble. All these different terms for the same measures. Can't we do better than that? Let's try harder, shall we? All right, so maybe that's the international business literature. Can we go deeper on the supply chain literature? Yes, we can. And the work, a lot of work was done with Lawson and Cousins and Menjic, and we had a bit of work by Chung and Kim, and we're going to have a look at these papers now. So Lawson et al., they looked at this notion of formal socialization and informal socialization. And then Cousins and Menjic looked at suppliers' communication performance, supply chain socialization, and this notion of socialization is very similar to this idea of relational governance. Okay, just got to have a look at the measures that are used, and we can see whether they're the same or not. Don't just rely on what the authors describe the variable as. Go to the measure. If the measure says something, then look at what the measure is saying. Prima facie, what does the measure mean by the questions it is asking? So let's have a look at Cousins and Lawson. Here, they're looking at communication-focused measures, and they're looking at innovation-focused measures. Now, these are much more formal because you can see that these are asking questions about the mechanisms or measures that the buyer has in place to get feedback from the supplier on different improvement areas. And it's different from socialization mechanisms that looked at more generic. So this maybe, we could call this monitoring, and we could call these measures as service performance measurement or operational performance measurement, like a monitoring and performance measurement. Ah, wow. So we're going through here. Can we learn more? We need more papers to get a sense of what's going on here. Well, let's have a look at Cousins, Hanfield, Lawson, and Peterson, where they looked at formal socialization mechanisms and informal socialization mechanisms. Now, the formal, again, remember, we're trying to understand what do we mean by formal. Well, formal is very similar to monitoring. Informal is very similar to socialization, like an informal socialization. So now this paper here has distinguished formal socialization from informal socialization. Wow. So a summary of these two literatures, that is the Zhao and Popo literature, they've focused on governance, explicit contracts, detailed contracts, customized contracts, whereas the Cousins literature focused more on formal socialization, detailed socialization, or monitoring, performance evaluation. Totally different terms, and there's a bit of overlap with what they are measuring. So we want to go deeper now and really do some more cutting and pasting, just like what I've done here, cutting and pasting, to find out, can we learn more from this literature? Again, there's our output controls, there's our behavior controls. So we want to go further. I dug up O'Donnell, which looked at a supply chain context, and they looked at outcome measurability and bureaucratic monitoring mechanisms. Wow. And then we looked at Hanfield, Cousins, and Lawson. They looked at supply place alignment, which is really a combination of monitoring, performance measurement, and possibly involvement. Wow. How did I get that? I didn't ask what did they describe their measure with. I went straight to the measurement here to say, what are they measuring? And then I termed it, well, that looks like monitoring to me. Then I read these three, that looks like measurement to me. It's simple. Go to the measures. What are the measurers measuring? What are the measures? Prima facie, what do the questions look like? Lao 2014 looked at supplier integration, supplier involvement, information sharing. Okay, so what does supplier involvement look like? There it is. Then we looked at internal coordination. It looks like monitoring to me if you look at all of these internal coordination measures. Again, they didn't call it monitoring, but this study here measured monitoring in my terms, but they used internal coordination. What about, and there's Lao again. And so what about Melander and Lakemold? Well, they looked at contract and relational governance, and that's how they have described those two constructs. What about Cosmo, Raymond, and Kaufman? It was 2018. It's a recent study. What are they measuring? Well, they're measuring direct involvement supplier engagement, and then they also looked at monitoring. Wow, they call it monitoring. So what did they call monitoring? Then you go in here to find out how did they explain monitoring, and then they explain it in details here. Monitoring as a critical transactional supply chain management practice, and it's different from performance evaluation. Okay, now notice performance evaluation is not in the model, but they start to talk about these terms here, and then they refer to Krauss 2007, 2000. Well, I better look at these two papers. You see how one literature takes you to another. So now we have another paper. Now I've got the Christian names here, not the surnames, and this paper was nice to actually do a study before their study to tabularize how various studies have actually measured or termed their governance mechanisms, and they call output control and behavior control, which is very much accounting to me. And so this is how they have measured their output control constructs here, and this is how they've measured their behavior control constructs here. Wow. So is there some summary we can get from this? Yes, I've actually put 3 columns, that is informal, and then formal monitoring, and then formal evaluation. And so I've got all of those papers I just reviewed here. And so Cousins and Menchik looked at socialization mechanisms. Lawson et al. Looked at informal socialization, distinguished it from informal socialization. Cousins and Lawson looked at monitoring. Cousins, Hanfield et al. Looked at informal and formal. Hanfield, Cousins et al. Looked at monitoring and measurement as parts of supply-based alignment. As you can see, we can start to see the orange representing a very socialization or relational type approach to control, whereas they're monitoring formal socialization becoming more like a hands-on behavior type control. And then we've got the measures in green, which is kind of like more of an output control, as Cosmo et al. 2018 split their monitoring into behavior and output, and then Hernandez et al. Looked at monitoring broken up into behavior and output as well. And I thought, wow, we can start to see some commonality here in what several studies are labeling the 3 different types of controls. That is a very, very formal outcome approach to control. We've got the formal behavior focus, and then we have the totally informal socialization type or relational approach to control. Wow. It gets complicated, doesn't it? I know why it takes so long to do a PhD, because you've got to try and digest all of these terms. But this is why you want to put them into tables like this, so you can start to say, well, hang on, they're using different variables, but they're all meaning the same type of construct. And this is what you need to get in your mind to do a creative literature review. I wanted to go further because remember, some of these studies referred to the work of Krauss. So now I pull out Krauss et al. 2000. They looked at direct involvement supplier strategies and supplier assessment. Then Krauss, Hanfield, and Tyler looked at direct involvement supplier development and supplier evaluation. And then Wanth and Hyde looked at socialization monitoring, and then Hyde, Wanth, and Rocker 2007 looked at social contract, and they split monitoring into behavior and output. So we can see that these papers here, very early studies in that area, are very, very clear on those 3 different areas that we can divide a control construct into. So now we're getting some clarity of what we want to call our control construct, or how many dimensions we want to have in our control construct. And so here are the summaries of those 4 papers. Again, I'm using my book to summarize. I cut and paste, and then I color in green, which refers to the measurement, and the yellow refers to the monitoring. You know that, don't you? You see, there's the green for measurement, and there's the yellow for the monitoring. Yes. And so we can go through to Krause, Hanford, and Tyler. I highlight yellow for measurement and green for monitoring. And then Ronth and Hyde, we've got a bit of green here for the monitoring area. And Hyde et al., the yellow for monitoring and of the behavior monitoring, and the green for output monitoring. As you can see, there's our summary of the literature review again of that clear dependent variable, and you can see you've got the orange, the yellow, and the green, and we're very, very clear now. So now we can write a short few paragraphs summarizing what the literature has done. If in the end I want to look at 3 dimensions or 2 dimensions, I can say that formal controls comprise behavior and outcome, which is widely used in established and ongoing supply chain relationships, and there we have all the papers that I've referred to. Behavior controls, on the other hand, refer to the process of monitoring the behavior of the supplier, and authors have referred to this construct as formal socialization. Internal coordination, the monitoring part of supply-based alignment. So you'd see now this is very clear. Why? Because I actually put this summary together of those papers. So now it's easier to write a paragraph, and your paragraph is complete. You're not leaving out a paper because you have summarized everything. And that's what you need to do. And this is how you can be more creative in writing a paragraph. Creativity does not give you license to leave out a reference if that paper has studied the dimension or construct that you are studying. Creativity means also that you are inclusive of all studies, but you are creative in describing how those studies are different from each other. So there we have, again, where we're heading. Now I have a clear understanding of what studies have looked at output controls and what studies have looked at behavior controls under formal monitoring mechanisms. Earlier, right at the beginning, we started at real general notion of control. Then we went down to formal control and informal control. Now, after knowing the literature hasn't focused on formal control, I've actually dug deeper into formal control and split it out into output controls and behavior control. So you can see now we've gone deeper, 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 and we have a lot of clarity over who has studied this and who has not studied this. So in the general international supply chain literature, very few studies have looked at output controls and behavior controls. But in the domestic supply chain literature, they have studied these dimensions. So now we can start focusing on the contribution. We can use your studies. So now we can focus on the contribution. We can use your summaries to guide your contribution. And this is what the literature review is about. And we can talk about, okay, the literature has looked at culture distance, geographical distance, and a lot of relational governance. Then the supply chain literature has looked at this distance, but they've looked at relational governance. Good. Then the domestic supply chain literature has actually broken apart this governance construct, this control construct, into socialization, into monitoring of outputs, into monitoring of behavior. And suddenly the dependent variable is parsed apart. And so now we're focusing on the formal control of output and behavior control, and we have the literature to support the focus on that in the domestic context, and we want to extend that to the international context, and then that makes it easier to write up a literature review, but at the end to say, well, as a result of our study, we are contributing to the literature because the literature has yet to really measure, if not study, formal governance in the international context. They really haven't theorized the use of formal governance. They've really focused on the relational governance. And so we're looking at the formal governance. Wow. So there's how we can focus on our contribution. So there we have it. 6 different steps I've taken you through. A lot of literature, a lot of tables and graphs, but the big takeaway is that there's no one literature or no one study has actually used the same terminology for the same constructs. You can see that using different terms for the same constructs, or they mean different constructs even when they use the same term. And what you need to do is actually go to the measures that the literature has looked at. In these 6 steps, I hope you can understand that going through these will actually bring completeness to your literature review. Very, very critical to completing your PhD in less than full time and possibly half the time, because once you've done this and once you spend more time writing up your studies or actually cutting and pasting in here, you know the literature and no one can debate your representation of the literature if you are very, very clear about not only what that literature is referring to as a name in the diagram or the model, but if you know what measure exactly was used. And no one can debate the measures that are used. They can say whether they're good or bad measures, but what they mean is what those questions are written, and you cannot change the content of those questions. So there you have it, 6 areas, literature review. I hope you can finish your PhD in half the time. See you in the next section, and thank you for watching. Bye for now. Go for it, you future PhD students, and don't give up.